So, you've just made your first playable game in Godot, and you want to share it with your friends or even strangers online. But before you package and send your project off to be judged, you want to make sure you check these essential settings so your game looks less like a hobby project and more like a real video game. The export process is the final step in packaging the game. The default settings can often look unpolished or even perform poorly. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share some essential settings which I learned over the last 287 hours so that your exports look as professional as possible. I will leave timestamps in the description in case you need to come back and check these in the future. Okay, let's get into it. You want to make sure that you set the resolution for your project. Do not leave it on the default 1152 by 648 unless that is intentional as part of your design. If I am working on a pixel art game, I prefer to make this 640 by 360 or 320 by 180, as this resolution will scale nicely with a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. It is important to note that the best results occur when scaling whole numbers. For example, 640 by 360 multiplied by 3 is 1080p. Also, pay attention to the mode setting. If your game is intended to be a full screen experience, make sure you export it as one. Not doing so can make your game come off as quite amateurish if the user has to configure the window settings upon launch. The options you can select are Window. Window mode doesn't occupy the whole screen unless you set its size to match the screen's resolution. Minimized. Minimized hides the game window, exactly the same as minimizing any application on Windows. Maximized. Maximized is a windowed mode that will occupy the whole screen except the taskbar and the program's border. Full screen. Full screen covers the whole screen with no border. This also has full multi-window support, unlike exclusive full screen, which also covers the entire screen. However, it can only run one window at a time. This window mode also has less overhead than regular full screen, meaning you can decide if you would prefer flexibility or performance in your project. Also consider if changing the initial position of your project is necessary. However, I find the default works for the majority of my game projects. It is also crucial to consider the stretch mode of your project. If disabled is selected, the game will be fixed at a set resolution, meaning it will be cropped when the window shrinks and will have large empty space if expanded. It is generally recommended to use either canvas items, which scales 2D elements, or viewport, which scales the entire viewport. One of the most visually impactful settings to check is the aspect mode. This setting is crucial as it determines how your project reacts to different sized monitors. For example, your game may be designed for the standard 16 by 9 ratio, but does your player use an ultra-wide monitor? Are they playing on a mobile device? Do they have an older 4 by 3 monitor ratio? Getting this wrong could be a huge red flag that your game is an amateur project. For the first option here, we can do exactly as the name tells us to do. Ignore it. This stretches your game's visuals and will distort your graphics to be wider or taller than intended to fit the monitor space. You will almost never use this when trying to avoid looking like a noob. Let's move on to Keep, which does exactly as it says. It will maintain your aspect ratio while scaling up as large as possible to fit the window area. This will not stretch or distort your project. However, this will also mean that black bars will surround your project when you do not have a matching aspect ratio with the monitor. Keep width will maintain the aspect ratio of your screen and the maximum width of your project window. However, if the screen is taller than your project, it will expand vertically. This will lead to more content being visible on the bottom of your screen than designed. If the width extends the maximum of your project, then black bars are added to the sides. You will also have to anchor your UI properly so it does not get cropped, where with Keep you could have fixed screen positions for your UI. Keep height behaves the same as keep width, but it maintains the height and then scales in the horizontal direction. This is useful for supporting taller screens, especially for portrait-oriented games. If the height extends the maximum of your project, then black bars are added to the top and the bottom. This is especially good for 2D horizontal scrolling games like runners or platformers. Expand scales your game while still maintaining the original aspect ratio. It essentially picks either keep width or keep height dynamically by deciding which directions can fit your whole project within the current window shape the best. Then it expands either horizontally or vertically. This is really useful as it adapts dynamically and smoothly to many screen sizes without the black bars or cropping occurring from the original view. Do note this can potentially reveal more than the borders of your game window intended, so don't leave any debugging assets or other junk just outside the main view when you export your project. Again, you may have to make sure your UI is anchored correctly and are not fixed in positions, otherwise this can ruin the professional game aesthetic you are chasing. Generally, I use the expand option. I may consider keep for projects when it is important to preserve the exact intended frame, such as a top-down horror game with something waiting just around the corner. If you are exporting to mobile, it is essential to check the orientation setting. Make sure it matches your game design. These settings essentially tell you what they are, so I won't go into too much depth here, and I'll move on to the next setting. Please do not just leave this next setting on default. This is a huge rookie mistake that can make your game's appearance suffer when it's just one click. The default texture filter setting allows your game to determine what color to show for each pixel on your screen. Computers rarely display textures exactly pixel for pixel as they were drawn. After you scale an image up, down, rotate it, or view it on a weird angle in 3D, the graphics card needs to figure out what color to assign each pixel. It does this by sampling the texture, then uses a texture filter to calculate the final color based on nearby texture pixels, or texels. Godot lets you decide the default filter which affects the game's look. Nearest picks the single texel closest to the point being sampled on the screen with no blending. This creates a sharp and blocky look, perfect for pixel art games. When scaling up, pixels become large squares. This looks most professional for intentional pixel art styles. However, scaling down can lead to jagged edges or a shimmering effect as pixels pop in and out. It also looks like crap if applied to high resolution textures, as it will make your project look more blocky and low quality. Linear is the default for the engine. It looks at the 4 closest texels and blends their colours together based on how close they are. This creates a smoother but slightly blurry look when compared to nearest. This is good for non-pixel art 2D projects. Looks like Dudukaka on pixel art projects and is most common rookie mistake I see when exporting these. The next settings include mipmaps in their calculations. Mipmaps are basically pre-calculated smaller versions of your texture. When textures appear far away, the engine will use one of these mipmaps instead of your huge original texture. The key benefits to mipmaps is that they reduce shimmering and noise on objects at a distance, in addition to boosting performance as the GPU can handle small textures faster. That being said, I'm still unsure on when to use nearest with mipmaps, as non-pixel art will still look like garbage using nearest calculations. And then when mipmaps are introduced to a pixel art project, they can produce slight blurring or color changes when scaling textures really small. Most generally, I found pixel artists stick to the pure nearest setting. Linear with mipmaps, however, is fantastic. If you're working on a high-res 2D project or almost any 3D project, turning on this setting will reduce the amount of shimmering in your project and also slightly boost performance. An easy way to add a level of polish to your project. My general rule of thumb is, if I'm working on a pixel art game, I will switch to nearest. For every other project, I switch to linear with mipmaps, so I don't do what I used to do when I started and leave this as a project default and make my game look worse for no reason. Another easy way to make sure that Godot is rendering your art style properly is by checking the anti-aliasing. Pixel art, again being an exception, may prefer to have lower multi-sample anti-aliasing to make edges more rough and jagged. But other art styles may prefer to have smooth edges and no jagged lines. Increasing your respective MSAA will make your project look more professional by doing this. However, this does come at a performance cost, so if you are developing for web or mobile, do test the limits of these settings. You will also want to customize your boot splash. Loading up the Godot icon against a grey background screams weekend project. Under Application, open the boot splash settings menu. Here we can set the background color, whether we want an image to show, if the image will scale to the size of the window, if we want to apply linear filtering, turn this off for pixel art images, and of course we can select which image we want to show during our boot splash by clicking this file icon and navigating to our desired file. In case you really want to show this image, you can also set a minimum time for this boot splash to show. However, it is recommended not to have this value too high. If you want to get fancy, what you can do is disable the image and set the background's alpha to 0. From here, we would then create a new scene and set it as the main scene. This would be our boot splash, which we would add animations and sounds to make it look more professional. Another way to add polish to your project and remove doubts that you are a real game developer is to have a custom mouse cursor. By clicking this file icon, you can then select your mouse image to use as your project default. If you need to play with the hotspot, which is the detection point of the cursor, you can adjust its offset here. Additionally, for any tooltips, You can adjust their offset here in case your new cursor collides with them. If you head over to the Config tab in Project Settings, here are a few quick and easy settings to fix. First of all, your project name. You don't want your friend opening a game called Hello World, so go ahead and update your application name. It is also useful to keep a record of your current version of your project here. You can also update the icon in this menu. Do note, however, that this is often overridden in the export presets. This can be found in the settings of your export template. Yes, I'm looking at a Windows build template, and the settings here may vary from platform to platform, but they all have an icon that you can override and apply to your build. Make sure you set this to the correct file format that the target platform accepts. Otherwise, your friends may be staring at the Godot icon when they launch your fake game. Anyways, other important settings to check here is again your product name. Confirm it is correct and override it if necessary. You can also list your company name here. The version will pass through what you set in the config settings. However, if you have different versions for different platforms, you may want them to override here. A critical setting to check when exporting is to ensure export with debug is disabled. This will create a build with debug tools and print console commands, which will be an indicator this is an amateur build. Now that we've gone through some essential settings to your Godot project, make sure you test any exports you create before you send them off to be judged. An important part of this process is tweaking settings and creating a new build only to test and repeat until you have a polished build that you're happy with. Also, make sure you remove any rubbish or unused assets from your project before you export it. This will minimize the final file size. This was by no means an exhaustive list of settings to perfect before you export, but it is a great place to start and ensure you aren't making any rookie mistakes. If you think there are any important settings that I missed, let me know down in the comments. If you got value from this video, perhaps a morsel of engagement would be really appreciated. I spent a bit longer in this video to ensure the content was concise and helpful. Okay, bye.